The party was in full swing at the neighbor's house, with laughter and loud music echoing through the thin walls. John felt his heart racing as he approached the entrance. He had suspected something for weeks, but confirmation came from an anonymous message. When he opened the door, the scene he found made his stomach turn, his wife, Emily, laughing and flirting with the neighbor, their bodies too close. The shock in her eyes when she saw him there was instantaneous. John didn't say a word, just stared at her, letting the weight of betrayal sink onto his shoulders. The party seemed to continue in slow motion as he turned and left, his mind racing with dark thoughts. Revenge began to take shape right there, on the cold sidewalk of New York, where the brightness of the city lights could no longer erase the darkness he felt inside. What he would do next would change everyone's lives forever. John has always been a man of routines. At 38, he had built a solid career as a lawyer in New York, driven by determination and unyielding ethics. He prided himself on being a good husband and father. Emily, his wife, was a public school art teacher known for her warm nature and easy smile. They lived in a comfortable apartment on the Upper West Side, a refuge from the urban chaos. Their marriage, which lasted more than a decade, was always seen as an example of a perfect union. They had an 8-year-old son, Lucas, a bright and energetic boy. John and Emily were always devoted to him, participating in all of his school and sporting activities. Life seemed to follow an ideal script, until small cracks began to appear. John noticed that Emily was becoming more and more distant. She started arriving late, citing school commitments and meetings with colleagues. At first, he believed her explanations, but the frequency of her delays and her blank stare at home made him uneasy. Conversations became superficial and laughter became rare. It was as if a veil of indifference had fallen between them. The neighbor, Mark, was a man with an imposing presence, always friendly to everyone. He moved into the building 2 years earlier and quickly integrated himself into the building's social circle. Single, successful and charming, Mark frequently organized events for residents, becoming a beloved figure. John and Emily, like most, attended several of these parties, where Mark always proved a generous host. That night started like any other. John returned home exhausted after an endless day at the office. Lucas was in the living room, watching a TV show, while Emily was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. He approached her, trying to start a conversation, but was met with a distracted smile and monosyllabic responses. The atmosphere was tense, and John decided to let it go, attributing her behavior to tiredness. During dinner, Emily mentioned the party at Mark's house. "You don't mind if I go, do you? I need to relax a little," he said, trying to sound casual. John nodded, although a twinge of distrust bothered him. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't want to confront her without proof. After Emily left, John put Lucas to bed and sat in the living room, trying to concentrate on a book. But the uneasiness grew, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening. It was then that his phone buzzed with an anonymous message: "Your wife is with Mark. Go over there and see for yourself." John's blood ran cold. He fought the urge to ignore the message, but curiosity and fear were stronger. He left the house, his mind racing, heading to Mark's apartment. The short path seemed eternal. When he arrived, he saw the party in full swing through the window. He took a deep breath, preparing himself for the worst, and entered without being noticed. The sight of Emily in Mark's arms was a devastating blow. She didn't notice his presence right away, but when she did, the panic in her eyes was evident. John didn't make a scene, he just turned and left, feeling like each step took him further away from the man he thought he was. The walk back home was a blur of emotions. Anger and pain mixed together, creating a whirlwind in his mind. When he arrived, he found Lucas sleeping peacefully. The sight of his son brought a sense of responsibility that he could not ignore. I needed to stay calm, for Lucas, and find a way to deal with the betrayal. Over the next few days, John maintained a facade of normalcy. Emily tried to talk to him several times, but he avoided her, fearing that any confrontation would result in an emotional breakdown. He began quietly planning his revenge, deciding he would expose Emily's betrayal and make her feel the pain he felt. He hired a private detective to follow Emily and collect evidence of her affair with Mark. The photos and messages he received only confirmed his suspicions and fueled his anger. John knew he needed to be meticulous and patient. Revenge, I thought, is a dish best served cold. As John worked out his plan, he continued to be the devoted father and capable professional he had always been. Lucas, oblivious to his parents' emotional turmoil, continued to be the joy of his life. John decided that his revenge would not only punish Emily, but also ensure that Lucas would not suffer the consequences of her betrayal. John's first step was to approach Mark in a calculated manner. One afternoon, he met him in the building's lobby and suggested a meeting to discuss a community project. Mark, without suspecting anything, readily accepted. John knew he needed to gain his neighbor's trust in order to publicly expose him. Thus, John began to outline the contours of his revenge. He was determined to turn pain into strategy, disappointment into action. The cat and mouse game was just beginning, and John was prepared for every move. The future, uncertain and dark, promised twists that no one could predict. The days passed slowly, and John became a shadow of the man he once was. His eyes, once full of life, now reflected the coldness of a meticulous plan. He began to study every detail of Mark and Emily's routine, looking for any flaw that he could use to his advantage. Revenge had become his motivation, the fuel that fueled his daily actions. The meeting with Mark took place in a cafe close to the building. John arrived punctually, finding Mark already settled in with a carefree smile. They discussed superficialities, community projects and life in the building. John maintained his mask of cordiality, feigning genuine interest. Mark's every word was analyzed and catalogued in his mind, another piece in the puzzle of his revenge. John's first move was simple but effective. He organized a social event in the building, with the intention of getting even closer to Mark and Emily. The party took place on a Saturday night, with the presence of several residents. John watched intently, interacting with the guests while keeping an eye on his wife and the neighbor. He noticed the furtive glances and uncomfortable closeness between them. Every gesture was a confirmation of his betrayal. During the event, John introduced Mark to a lawyer friend, suggesting they could collaborate on a project. Mark, flattered, accepted the proposal without hesitation. John knew that gaining Mark's trust was crucial to the success of his plan. He would need to be close enough to unmask him at the right time. In the days that followed, John began to implant subtle doubts in Emily's mind. Casual comments about fidelity, stories of betrayals by acquaintances and reflections on trust in a relationship. Emily, already racked with guilt, began to show signs of anxiety. John watched silently, pleased to see his words had an impact. The private detective continued to provide evidence, and John accumulated each piece of evidence with meticulous care. Photos of meetings, messages exchanged and even recordings of compromising conversations. He knew that, when the time was right, this evidence would be his ultimate weapon. One day, while Emily was at work, John received a call from the detective. "There's something you need to see," the voice on the phone said. They met in a discreet cafe, and the detective handed over a thick envelope. John opened it, finding a series of photos of Emily and Mark together in various places. Among the images, one stood out, Lucas, smiling and playing with Mark in a park. The physical resemblance between them was undeniable, and the revelation fell upon John like a final blow. Lucas was Mark's biological son. The discovery shook John deeply, but he decided to use this information as part of his revenge. He needed to expose Emily and Mark, but also protect Lucas from any trauma. John spent sleepless nights, planning every detail, every move. Revenge would be precise and devastating. He began manipulating situations to increase tension between Emily and Mark. Ingratiating comments, abruptly interrupted conversations, and even the suggestion that he was aware of the affair. Emily began to show signs of nervousness, and Mark, although more confident, also showed concern. John organized a dinner at home, inviting Mark and some close friends. During the meal, he casually mentioned the importance of loyalty and the destruction that betrayal can cause in a family. Emily almost dropped her glass of wine, and Mark tried to maintain his composure, but the tension was palpable. John knew the moment of revelation was approaching, and he needed to be prepared. The perfect opportunity arose when Mark invited John to an out-of-town business meeting. They traveled together, and John took advantage of the opportunity to strengthen his relationship of trust with his neighbor. During the trip, he asked questions about Mark's personal life, trying to extract any information he could use later. Mark, feeling safe, talked about his past relationships and his future ambitions, not realizing that every word was a weapon in John's hands. Back in New York, John intensified his actions. He began leaving subtle clues for Emily, like phone messages that suggested he knew more than he let on. Emily, already worn down by guilt and fear, began to break down. His absences became more frequent, and his excuses, more fragile. Finally, John decided it was time to play his final card. He arranged a meeting with Mark and Emily at the neighbor's house under the guise of discussing an important project. John arrived early, discreetly adjusting the cameras he had hidden to record everything. When Emily arrived, John noticed her nervousness. Mark, on the other hand, seemed confident, believing he was in control of the situation. During the meeting, John confronted them with the evidence he had collected. Photos, messages and recordings were displayed on the table, each one more incriminating than the last. Emily broke down in tears, while Mark tried to justify his actions. John remained calm, watching coldly as the truth unfolded before him. But the final blow was the revelation about Lucas. "You think you can destroy my life and get away with it?" John said, his voice cool and controlled. "Lucas is your son, Mark. And I have the proof to show everyone." The reaction was devastating. Emily broke down, unable to bear the guilt and shame. Mark turned pale, speechless, realizing the extent of his actions. John left his neighbor's house, feeling a strange satisfaction. Revenge was underway, and he knew the repercussions would be profound. He still had a lot to do to ensure justice was done, but in that moment, he tasted the initial victory. The room was silent, only broken by Emily's sobs and the distant hum of New York traffic. John remained standing, observing the chaos he had unleashed with a cold, calculating gaze. Emily tried to compose herself, wiping away her tears as she looked desperately at Mark, looking for some kind of support or explanation. "You knew all along," Emily's voice was shaky, almost a whisper. "You knew and let us continue?" John nodded slowly. "Yes, I knew. And I allowed you to dig your own grave. What surprised me was the extent of your betrayal." Mark, still pale, tried to regain some control of the situation. "John, we can work this out. Think about Lucas. He doesn't need to be dragged into this." John laughed, a bitter, empty sound. "Lucas is the only reason I didn't expose this sooner. But you left me no choice. You destroyed our family, Mark. You destroyed everything." The tension in the room was almost palpable as John's words hung in the air. Emily tried to move closer to him, but John took a step back, his expression hardening. "Don't you dare touch me," he growled. "You have lost that right." Emily backed away, tears filling her eyes again. "I was confused, John. Mark manipulated me. I thought you didn't love me anymore." "Didn't you love me anymore?" John repeated, incredulity coloring his voice. "You thought I didn't love you, so you decided to cheat on me with the neighbor. And it wasn't just a betrayal. You had a son with him and made me believe that Lucas was mine." Mark intervened, trying to defuse the situation. John, Emily is right. It was a terrible mistake, but we can't let this destroy everything. We can find a way to move forward. John stared at Mark with deadly coldness. Move on. Do you really think there's a move on after this? You think you can destroy my family and get away with it? John's fury was evident, but he remained controlled. I'm not going to kill you, Mark. It would be too easy. I want you to feel what I felt. I want you to see your life crumble before you, just like mine did. Mark tried to argue, but John interrupted him. You will leave this city. You will disappear from our lives. And if you try anything at all, the evidence of this betrayal will end up in the hands of the right people. Your reputation, your career, everything you have built, will disappear. Emily fell to her knees, begging for forgiveness. John, please don't do this. Think about Lucas. He needs us. John looked at her with a mixture of sadness and anger. Lucas is the only reason I'm willing to give you a chance. But I will never trust you again. Our relationship will never be the same. He turned to Mark one last time. You have until the end of the week to get out of here. If I still see you in New York after this, the consequences will be devastating. Mark nodded, defeated. He knew John wasn't bluffing. I'll leave. You have my word. John didn't respond. He took the evidence from the table and left Mark's house, leaving a trail of emotional destruction behind him. The walk home was a mixture of relief and pain. He had begun revenge, but he knew there was still a long way to go. Over the next few days, John maintained his usual routine, but now with renewed determination. He watched Emily and Mark's every move, making sure they kept their promises. Mark started packing his things, and within a few days, his apartment was empty. John felt a grim satisfaction as he watched his neighbor leave, knowing that his life had been irrevocably changed. Emily, on the other hand, was in a constant state of anxiety. She tried to redeem herself, doing everything she could to show John that she still loved him and deeply regretted it. But John remained distant, cold, without allowing her to get close emotionally. One night, while Lucas was in bed, Emily approached John in the living room. Can we talk? She asked, her voice breaking. John sighed but nodded. Speak. I'm sorry, John. I'm sorry for everything. I know I can't undo what I did, but I'm willing to do anything to save our marriage. John looked at her, his eyes reflecting the pain he felt. Emily, you destroyed my confidence. You broke something inside me that may never be fixed. I want to believe we can get through this, but I don't know if it's possible. Emily wiped away a tear, trying to find the right words. I'll do anything, John. Therapy, marriage counseling, whatever it takes. Just don't leave me. Don't let our family fall apart. John was silent for a moment, fighting anger and sadness. We'll try, he said finally. But know that it won't be easy. And it won't be quick. It will take time, and you need to be willing to face it. Emily nodded fervently. I'm willing, John. Thanks for giving me a chance. John didn't respond. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew he needed to try, for Lucas if not for anyone else. Revenge was underway, but he needed to balance that with the responsibility of being a good father. The days turned into weeks, and life continued tensely and silently. John stayed busy with his work and devoted every spare moment to Lucas, trying to provide his son with a sense of normalcy amid the chaos his life had become. Emily, in turn, dedicated herself entirely to regaining John's trust, attending every therapy session and making a conscious effort to repair the damage done. Therapy began with individual sessions, where both could express their emotions and frustrations without fear of judgment. The therapist, a calm and experienced man, helped John deal with his anger and resentment, while Emily worked on understanding her own actions and motivations. The joint sessions were even more difficult, as they required brutal honesty and painful confrontations. John, although reluctant, began to see small changes in Emily. She was genuinely sorry and committed to repairing the relationship. However, the pain of the betrayal and discovery about Lucas still weighed heavily on his heart, making it difficult for him to open up completely. Meanwhile, John continued to monitor Mark's situation. He discovered that Mark had moved to a small town, far from New York, trying to start his life over. While the physical distance brought some relief, John knew the emotional scars would remain. On a particularly cold winter night, while New York was covered in snow, John received an unexpected call. It was from the private detective. "John, I have something you need to see. Can we meet?" John nodded, feeling a pang of apprehension. They met in a discreet cafe, as usual. The detective handed him an envelope, and John opened it, finding new photos and documents. Mark was involved in suspicious activity in the new city, possibly linked to financial fraud. "Why is this important to me?" John asked, intrigued. "Because it might be an opportunity to make sure he doesn't cause trouble again," the detective replied. "If this information gets into the right hands, Mark could be investigated and eventually arrested." John pondered the proposal. Part of him wanted to see Mark completely destroyed, paying for every mistake and betrayal. But he also knew he needed to focus on his own life and rebuilding what was left of his family. He decided to act. He turned the information over to the proper authorities, ensuring that Mark was investigated. The feeling of justice, although cold, brought him momentary peace. He knew he was doing what was right, not just for himself, but to make sure Mark didn't hurt anyone else. With Mark out of the picture, John turned his full attention to Emily and Lucas. Therapy sessions began to show more significant results. Emily opened her heart in ways she never had before, sharing deep fears, insecurities, and regrets. John, in turn, allowed himself vulnerability, acknowledging his own pain and frustrations. One night, while they were together in the living room, Emily held John's hand. "I know I did something unforgivable, and I know you may never forgive me completely. But I want you to know that I love you and always have. And I will do everything I can to prove it every day." John looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. "I love you too, Emily. And that's why this hurts so much. But I'm willing to try, for us and for Lucas." They hugged, a simple gesture but full of meaning. It was the beginning of a long healing process, a necessary step to rebuild the trust and love that had been destroyed. In the months that followed, John and Emily worked tirelessly on their relationship. Therapy sessions continued, as did daily efforts to reconnect. Lucas, oblivious to many of the grim details, flourished with his parents' renewed attention and love. John knew the road ahead would be long and full of challenges. Revenge had brought a sense of justice, but not complete peace. He needed to learn to forgive, to let go of the anger, and to find a way to love again without reservation. The climax of her journey was not an explosion of emotions, but a quiet understanding that life is complex and nuanced. John and Emily weren't just trying to save a marriage, they were rebuilding their own identities and finding a new path together. The months passed, and life began to find a new rhythm. John and Emily, still in the healing process, began to rebuild what was left of their relationship. Lucas, happy and carefree, was a constant reminder that the effort was worth it. John knew that trust wouldn't be restored overnight, but the small steps forward were significant. John dedicated himself more and more to work and family, trying to balance the two important parts of his life. He began to seek new opportunities in his career, finding in his professional progress a way to channel the emotions he still struggled to control. Emily, in turn, continued with therapy and found ways to strengthen her bonds with John and Lucas. One morning, as John was getting ready for another day at the office, he received a text from Mark. Surprised, he cautiously opened the text. Mark was desperate, asking to meet John one last time. Reluctant but curious, John decided to grant the request. They met in a cafe outside the city, away from known eyes. Mark was visibly haggard, with deep circles under his eyes and an expression of despair. "John, I know I have no right to ask for anything, but I need your help," Mark began, his voice shaking. John crossed his arms, maintaining an impassive expression. "Why should I help you, Mark? After everything you've done?" Mark sighed, running his hands through his hair. "I've made a lot of mistakes, and I'm paying for them. But now, I'm being threatened. The people I've been involved with are not the forgiving type." John looked at him, considering his words. "And what exactly do you expect me to do?" "I need a lawyer. Someone who can help me get out of this situation before it's too late. I know I don't deserve your help, but I'm asking, as one last hope." John considered the situation. The prospect of helping Mark was repulsive, but the idea that he could be a risk to his own safety and to Emily and Lucas was even worse. "Very well," he said finally. "I'll help you, but know that this doesn't change anything between us. I'm doing this to protect my family." Mark nodded gratefully. "Thank you, John. I'll do whatever it takes to right my wrongs." From that meeting on, John became involved in Mark's defense, using his skills to ensure the situation was resolved fairly and quickly. He kept Emily informed about what was going on, making sure she knew the family's safety was his priority. While working on Mark's case, John realized something important. Through this process, he was finding a new way to deal with his anger and resentment. Helping Mark, despite everything, was allowing him to process his own emotions in a healthier way. Emily, seeing John's effort to resolve the situation, felt closer to him. She knew he was still hurt, but John's willingness to face the problem head-on was a sign that he was trying to move on. Therapy continued to be a crucial part of their lives. John and Emily began to address the deeper issues in their relationship, exploring the reasons that led them to that situation and looking for ways to prevent the same mistakes from happening again. John began to realize that rebuilding his marriage wasn't just about forgiving Emily, but also about forgiving himself for not seeing the signs and not being able to prevent the betrayal. One particularly revealing moment happened during a joint therapy session. The therapist asked them both to write letters to each other, expressing their feelings without the interference of immediate dialogue. John hesitated, but ended up putting his frustrations, hurts and hopes for the future on paper. Emily did the same. When they read the letters to each other, there were tears and reconciliation. They realized that, despite everything, there was still love and respect between them. The letters became a symbol of their journey together, a reminder that they were willing to fight for what really mattered. Meanwhile, Mark managed to resolve his legal issues with John's help. He left town permanently, promising never to interfere in John and Emily's lives again. John felt a sense of relief to see Mark go, knowing that he could finally focus completely on his family without the shadow of the past hanging over them. Life began to stabilize. John and Emily rediscovered the pleasure of little things, a family dinner, a walk in the park with Lucas, a quiet conversation at the end of the day. Every moment was a victory, a step toward healing. John still carried emotional scars, but he was learning to live with them. He knew that complete trust might never be restored, but he was willing to keep trying, one day at a time. Revenge had lost its luster, replaced by a deeper desire for peace and reconciliation. And so, life went on, imperfect but full of possibilities. John and Emily were ready to face the future, knowing that together they could overcome any obstacle. Winter in New York was fading, giving way to the promise of a renewing spring. John, Emily and Lucas were beginning to find a new rhythm, a new normality. The emotional scars still existed, but there was a conscious effort to rebuild the trust and intimacy that had been devastated. John was in his office when he received an unexpected call from his brother, David, who lived in Boston. "John, I need to talk to you." "It's urgent," David said, his voice tense. "Of course, what happened?" John asked, worried. "It's about Mark. He was found dead in his home last night. The police are investigating, but it appears to be a suicide." John was silent, absorbing the news. Despite all the resentment she felt towards Mark, his death brought a whirlwind of emotions. Part of him felt relieved that a painful cycle had come to an end, but another part felt responsible, in some way, for the tragic outcome. David continued, "I know you had problems with him, but I thought you should know. If you need anything, I'm here." "Thanks, David. I'll digest this and then we'll talk more," John replied, hanging up the phone. John spent the rest of the day in a state of introspection. Upon returning home, he decided to tell Emily about Mark's death. She was shocked, tears streaming down her face. "John, do you think that was because of us?" "I don't know, Emily. He was involved in a lot of things. But we can't let that destroy us too. We need to focus on what we have now," John said, trying to calm her down. Over the next few days, news of Mark's death spread, but John and Emily decided to keep their distance from the situation. They continued to focus on their family, trying to find peace after so much turmoil. But Mark's ghost still hung over them, a constant reminder of past mistakes and betrayals. One night, while Lucas was in bed, John and Emily had a deep conversation about the future. "I want us to know we're doing the right thing, John. For us and for Lucas," Emily said, holding his hand. "Me too, Emily. And I think we're on the right track. Let's focus on building something new, something worthwhile," replied John, feeling a weight lifted from his shoulders. Months passed, and the family began to truly stabilize. Therapy helped resolve many issues, and John and Emily began to rediscover their love for each other. In an effort to start over, they decided to move to a new home, away from the painful memories of the past. Lucas was excited about the change, happy to explore a new environment. The new house was spacious and full of light, a symbol of a new beginning. John and Emily dedicated themselves to creating new memories, focusing on strengthening their union and providing a happy life for Lucas. However, fate had one more twist in store. One morning, while unpacking boxes at the new house, John found an envelope addressed to him, with no return address. When he opened it, he found a letter written by Mark before his death. "John, if you are reading this, it means my life has come to an end. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know the truth. I was forced to make terrible decisions, and I got involved with dangerous people. My life became unsustainable, and I saw death as the only way out. But there is something you need to know. Emily never knew Lucas was my son. It was a decision I made alone, for fear of losing everything. She was innocent in many ways, and the weight of the truth was mine alone. I ask you to take care of her and Lucas. And please find a way to move forward, free from the shadows of the past. Mark." John was silent, absorbing the words. The revelation brought a new layer of complexity to the situation. Emily didn't know. She was, in many ways, a victim of circumstances just like him. John felt a mix of relief and sadness, but also a renewed determination to move forward. He shared the letter with Emily that night. She read, tears flowing silently. "I didn't know, John. I swear I didn't know." "I believe you," John said, hugging her. "And this just reaffirms what we need to do. We need to move forward, together." Time passed, and life began to settle in the new house. John and Emily continued to work on their relationship, building something stronger and truer. Lucas, oblivious to adult complexities, grew up happy and healthy, surrounded by the love and care of his parents. John, Emily, and Mark's story was a web of love, betrayal, and redemption. The revenge John initially sought turned into a journey of forgiveness and self-discovery. Mark's death, although tragic, served as a catalyst for true healing. And so, under the clear sky of the new spring, the family found the peace they longed for. Not without scars, but with the certainty that, together, they could overcome any adversity. Life continued, imperfect, but full of new possibilities.